In the merciless expanse of Wyoming's Teton wilderness, where winter storms paint landscapes in deadly white and survival hangs by fragile threads, one woman's extraordinary journey defied all expectations. This is the remarkable story of Rebecca Harlow, a 32-year-old wildlife photographer who survived an apocalyptic blizzard by finding sanctuary within a wolf pack, adopting their ways and enduring alongside them for 78 days in the frozen backcountry. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Through instinct intelligence and an uncanny connection with creatures most humans fear, Rebecca not only survived the killing cold that claimed 4 experienced hikers that same season, but found herself transformed by an experience few could imagine and even fewer would survive. Her rescue came not through conventional search parties, but at the hands of Thomas Blackfeather, a Shoshone wilderness guide, whose tracking abilities led him to the most unexpected discovery of his 20-year career. A woman who had crossed the threshold between human and wolf to emerge as something altogether unique. Join us as we uncover the astonishing tale of catastrophe, survival, and the primal bonds formed when civilization falls away and human meets wilderness on equal terms. This is a story that challenges our understanding of both human resilience and the complex intelligence of the creatures with whom we share this planet. The winter of 2018 had been unforgiving across the American Northwest, with temperature records shattered and snowfall exceeding historical averages by nearly 40%. But by early March, meteorologists had cautiously announced the worst was behind them. For the residents of Jackson Hole, Wyoming, this forecast offered the promise of economic recovery after months of tourism disruption and regional isolation. Among those welcoming the meteorological reprieve was Rebecca Harlow, whose photography business had suffered alongside the local economy. Rebecca had built her reputation documenting the region's wildlife, particularly its wolves, capturing images that graced the pages of National Geographic, Outdoor Photographer, and various conservation publications. Her work balanced artistic vision with scientific documentation, contributing to ongoing research while bringing the hidden realities of wild predators into public consciousness. Rebecca had moved to Wyoming 8 years earlier from Minneapolis, abandoning a promising but unfulfilling career in corporate marketing. The transition hadn't been easy. Her parents, both medical professionals with practical mindsets, viewed her career change as reckless idealism. Her ex-husband, Stephen, had refused to uproot his legal practice, ultimately choosing his career over their marriage. But Rebecca had remained resolute, drawn to the mountains by something she could never fully articulate, a restlessness that only found peace in wild spaces. Some people are born with wilderness in their blood, her grandfather William had told her before his passing. A former park ranger in Yellowstone during the 1960s, he had recognized in his granddaughter the same pull toward untamed landscapes that had shaped his own life. It was his old cabin, situated on 15 acres, bordering national forest land, that Rebecca now called home. The cabin stood 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, a rustic structure of lodgepole pine logs with solar panels that Rebecca had installed to power her editing equipment and essential appliances. A wood stove provided heat during the brutal winters, and a natural spring delivered fresh water year-round. To many, the isolation seemed extreme. To Rebecca, it offered the perfect balance between functional civilization and proximity to her. Photographic subjects. The cabin's walls displayed her most powerful work: wolves hunting at dawn, bison battling through snowdrifts, eagles riding thermals against impossible mountain backdrops. But it was the wolves that dominated both her professional portfolio and personal fascination. Rebecca had documented 3 distinct packs over the years: recognizing individual animals, their hierarchies, and territories with the precision of a field biologist. Her favorite subjects were the Granite Ridge Pack, 12 wolves whose territory encompassed the rugged landscape several miles north of her property. Led by a striking black alpha female Rebecca had named Artemis, the pack had demonstrated remarkable resilience despite hunting pressures and territorial conflicts with neighboring groups. Rebecca had spent hundreds of hours observing them from carefully positioned blinds, capturing their hunting strategies, pup-rearing behaviors, and complex social interactions. Dr. Eleanor Whitaker, lead wildlife biologist at Grand Teton National Park, had become both colleague and friend through their shared interest in the region's wolves. What makes Rebecca's work exceptional isn't just her technical skill, Dr. Whitaker later explained to investigators. It's her patience and intuition. She anticipates behaviors before they happen. She thinks like the animals she photographs. This intuitive understanding had earned Rebecca rare access to conduct photography workshops in restricted wildlife areas, where she taught small groups of aspiring photographers the ethics of wildlife documentation alongside technical skills. These workshops, typically held in warmer months, provided financial stability that allowed her to pursue more creative and research-oriented projects during winter. March should have marked the beginning of planning for the upcoming workshop season. Instead, Rebecca found herself pursuing a rare opportunity, the chance to document wolf behavior during the final phase of winter, when prey scarcity forces packs to adopt their most sophisticated hunting strategies. Dr. Whitaker had secured a special research permit allowing limited access to a remote section of wilderness where the Granite Ridge Pack had recently been tracked via radio collar signals. The permit's good for 5 days, Eleanor had told Rebecca over coffee in Jackson. The weather forecast looks stable, cold, but clear. The wolves were spotted near Black Rock Creek yesterday. If you can get some documentation of their late winter hunting patterns, it would be incredibly valuable for our study on predator-prey dynamics. For Rebecca, the opportunity was irresistible. Beyond its professional value, the assignment offered escape from the restlessness that had plagued her since January, when unusually heavy snowfall had confined her to the cabin for nearly 3 weeks. The isolation, normally a comfort, had begun to feel oppressive during those storm-bound days. This expedition promised freedom, purpose, and reconnection with the animals that had become central to her life's work. The evening before her departure, Rebecca methodically prepared her equipment: 2 camera bodies, multiple lenses including her prized 600mm telephoto, spare batteries, solar charger, memory cards, GPS, satellite phone, and the specialized cold weather housing that protected her gear from the extreme temperatures. Her camping equipment was equally well considered: a 4-season tent, Arctic-rated sleeping bag, portable stove, freeze-dried meals, water purification system, and multiple layers of technical clothing designed for mountain conditions. Rebecca's preparation reflected 8 years of wilderness experience, including winter survival training she had completed through the renowned Mountain Skills Academy. She had earned Wilderness First Responder certification and had successfully navigated challenging backcountry situations before. By all objective measures, she was well-equipped and sufficiently experienced for a 5-day solo expedition in territory she knew intimately. What no one could have anticipated, not Rebecca, not Dr. Whitaker, not even the regional meteorologists, was the catastrophic storm system forming over the Pacific Northwest, one that would defy all weather models and sweep across the Tetons with unprecedented fury less than 48 hours later. Rebecca's last human contact occurred at 7:14 a.m. on March 5th, when she sent a text message to Eleanor from the Black Rock Creek trailhead. Perfect conditions. Starting ascent. Should reach observation point by afternoon. We'll check in via satellite at 8 p.m. The message delivered, she shouldered her 40-pound pack, secured her snowshoes, and began the 6-mile trek into the backcountry. The initial hours of Rebecca's journey progressed exactly as planned. The hiking trail, though snow-covered, was well marked with reflective blazes on trees, allowing for relatively straightforward navigation. The morning air hung crisp and clear, with temperatures hovering around 15 degrees Fahrenheit, cold but manageable with proper layering. The recent days of stable weather had compacted the snowpack enough to make snowshoeing efficient, and Rebecca maintained a steady pace of about 2 miles per hour. She paused occasionally to photograph the winter landscape, sunlight refracting through ice crystals on pine boughs, a red fox hunting voles in a meadow, the distinctive track pattern of a pine marten crossing her path. These were context shots, scene setters for the wolf documentation that was her primary objective, but they revealed Rebecca's perpetual awareness of the ecosystem's interconnected elements. By early afternoon, she had reached the elevated ridge that Dr. Whitaker had suggested as an ideal observation point. From this vantage, Rebecca could survey a vast basin where the granite ridge pack had been successfully hunting elk forced down from higher elevations by the deep snow. The location offered both the distance necessary for unobtrusive observation and the proximity required for detailed photography with her telephoto equipment. Rebecca efficiently established her campsite in a sheltered location 50 yards back from the ridge's edge, where a cluster of mature fir trees provided natural windbreak. She set up her four-season tent on a packed snow platform, secured her food in a bear canister, necessary even in winter as the region's grizzlies sometimes emerged during warm periods, and organized her equipment for quick deployment when wildlife appeared. The afternoon yielded no wolf sightings, though Rebecca observed several elk moving cautiously through the basin below. Using her satellite phone, she sent a brief check-in message to Eleanor, confirming her safe arrival at the observation point and reporting the coordinates of fresh wolf tracks she had noted approximately 1 mile from her position. As evening approached, Rebecca prepared a simple meal of rehydrated stew and recorded her first day's observations in the waterproof journal she maintained for all field expeditions. Her final entry that day revealed nothing unusual. Sunset, 5:51 p.m. Barometric pressure, steady, temperature dropping to approx. 10 degrees Celsius overnight. Wolf howls, heard distantly northwest of camp at 5:30 p.m. Will begin observation before dawn. Expectation of pack movement through East Corridor based on prey patterns. The first indication of changing weather came shortly after midnight, when Rebecca was awakened by wind gusts strong enough to shake her tent despite its sheltered position. Checking her portable weather monitor, she noted a sudden drop in barometric pressure and rapid temperature decline, conditions consistent with an approaching storm system, though far more dramatic than the minor fluctuations forecast before her departure. By 4:00 a.m., the situation had deteriorated significantly. Wind speeds exceeded 40 miles per hour, driving fine snow through even the smallest openings in Rebecca's tent. The temperature had plummeted to -15 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill factors approaching -40, conditions that transformed survival dynamics from routine to critical. Rebecca attempted communication via satellite phone, but the intensifying storm prevented signal connection. Her years of experience prompted immediate defensive action. She reinforced her tent anchors with additional snow stakes, moved essential survival gear into her sleeping bag to prevent freezing, and calculated supply rationing for an extended shelter-in-place scenario. Dawn brought no improvement, what meteorologists would later describe as a polar vortex anomaly had developed into a blizzard of historic proportions. Visibility had reduced to less than 10 feet, and snow accumulated. At nearly 3 inches per hour, Wind gusts now approached 60 miles per hour, creating disorienting ground blizzard conditions, even between snowfall periods. In her subsequent statement to search and rescue personnel, Rebecca described the critical decision point that occurred. Around 10 a.m. on March 6th, the tent began to fail structurally despite reinforcement. The primary pole cracked under snow load and wind pressure. I recognized that without adequate shelter, hypothermia would become inevitable, regardless of my other equipment. I needed to relocate immediately to more substantial protection or risk. Becoming completely immobilized by cold, the decision to abandon a compromised shelter during a blizzard contradicts conventional wilderness survival guidance, which typically recommends remaining in place until conditions improve. However, Rebecca's assessment of her failing equipment created what survival experts term a calculated emergency response, choosing the less dangerous of two lethal options. Rebecca later recalled the sequence of actions that followed. Securing her most essential survival items in her internal pack, fire starter knife, emergency blanket, some food, first aid supplies, donning every available layer of clothing, and using her compass to orient toward a rock formation she had noted approximately 1/4 mile northwest of her camp during the previous day's approach. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I knew the formation might provide a rock shelter, or at minimum a windbreak, she explained. It was the only landmark I could confidently navigate to in zero visibility conditions. What Rebecca could not have known was that her camp abandonment coincided with territory patrol activity by the very wolves she had come to photograph. The Granite Ridge Pack, pressured by the same storm conditions, had moved into the lower elevation forest, seeking shelter among the dense pine stands and rock outcroppings. Rebecca's journey toward the rock formation became increasingly desperate as conditions worsened. The combination of deep, unconsolidated snow and hurricane-force wind gusts repeatedly knocked her off balance. Her snowshoes, designed for efficient travel rather than stability in extreme conditions, became liability rather than asset in the chaotic ground blizzard. Approximately 15 minutes into her desperate relocation attempt, Rebecca lost her footing on an obscured incline and fell, tumbling nearly 30 feet down a snow-covered slope before colliding with a partially buried log. The impact fractured 2 ribs on her left side and dislocated her right shoulder, injuries that severely compromised her mobility and dramatically accelerated hypothermia risk. Wilderness survival statistics indicate that compound emergency situations, where injury complicates environmental threat, reduce survival probability by approximately 60 and 70%. For Rebecca, dislocated shoulder meant she could no longer effectively deploy her emergency shelter, make fire, or properly manage her remaining gear. I remember understanding with perfect clarity that I was likely going to die, Rebecca later stated. Not panic, just a clinical acknowledgement that the situation had exceeded survivable parameters. Every breath sent knives through my chest from the broken ribs. I couldn't raise my right arm above chest level, and the temperature was still dropping. It was in this moment of extremity that Rebecca's story diverged from conventional wilderness tragedy and entered the realm of the extraordinary. As she struggled to create a snow cave with her one functioning arm, a last-ditch survival effort, she became aware of movement approximately 20 yards away, visible as shadowy forms through the driving snow. Initially, Rebecca assumed the shapes were fellow humans, perhaps a search team deployed despite the dangerous conditions. This hope evaporated when the distinctive profile of a large wolf emerged from the whiteout, standing motionless, watching her with evident assessment. Rebecca immediately recognized the animal as Artemis, the Granite Ridge Pack's alpha female, identifiable by distinctive white markings on her chest and face. Behind Artemis, at least 3 other pack members materialized from the blowing snow, creating a semicircle around Rebecca's position. Conventional wisdom holds that wolves avoid human encounters whenever possible, and that aggressive approach is virtually unheard of outside of rabies cases or extreme food scarcity. The behavior Rebecca witnessed contradicted expected patterns. The wolves neither fled nor displayed aggression, instead exhibiting what wildlife biologists later termed investigative assessment. "They were evaluating me," Rebecca explained. "There was a cognitive process happening that went beyond instinctive response. Artemis particularly seemed to be processing my condition, my injury, my inadequate shelter, my hypothermic state. I had observed similar assessment behavior when pack members encountered injured elk, but this was different. There was no predatory intent that I could discern. For approximately 10 minutes, this unusual standoff continued. Rebecca remained as motionless as her deteriorating condition allowed, applying her years of wildlife observation experience to avoid behaviors that might trigger predatory response. The wolves maintained their semicircle, occasionally exchanging what Rebecca described as communicative glances and subtle postural adjustments. What happened next defies simple explanation. Artemis approached Rebecca directly, closing the distance to approximately 6 feet, close enough that Rebecca could see the crystallized breath emerging from the wolf's nostrils. Rather than displaying aggression, the alpha female lay down in the snow, creating a windbreak between Rebecca and the strongest gusts. Within moments, 2 other wolves, later identified as sub-adult pack members, positioned themselves similarly on Rebecca's other side. "In my hypothermic state, I initially thought I was hallucinating," Rebecca acknowledged. "But the heat radiating from their bodies was unmistakably real. They were creating a thermal barrier against conditions that would have killed me within hours." Wildlife biologists have documented rare cases of interspecies protection and alliance in extreme conditions, though typically between species with established mutualistic relationships. The behavior Rebecca experienced has no direct precedent in scientific literature. Wolves intentionally sheltering an injured human during life-threatening weather. Dr. Whitaker, when first presented with Rebecca's account, offered tentative context. Rebecca was not a stranger to this particular pack. She had observed them for hundreds of hours over multiple years, always respecting boundaries and never interfering. There's emerging research suggesting wolves can distinguish between individual humans and may categorize some as non-threatening after repeated neutral encounters. But what she describes goes beyond recognition into active intervention. That's unprecedented. As the blizzard intensified through the afternoon and into evening, Rebecca drifted between consciousness and what medical professionals later described as environmental hypnagogia, a semi-conscious state often preceding hypothermic death. The wolves remained positioned around her, their body heat providing critical thermal support that slowed her core temperature decline. During moments of lucidity, Rebecca observed the wolves' rotating positions, with different animals moving into direct contact, while others maintained vigilance at the perimeter. This coordinated behavior mirrored how wolf packs protect vulnerable pups during severe weather, a protection pattern now extended to a human beneficiary. "I understood that I was experiencing something extraordinary," Rebecca later wrote, but preservation instinct superseded analysis. "I was surviving minute by minute, focused entirely on maintaining consciousness and minimizing movement that aggravated my injuries." The wolves' presence registered as safety rather than threat, a complete inversion of what most humans would expect. As night fell and temperatures dropped below -25 degrees Fahrenheit, the storm showed no signs of abating. Search operations, which would normally have been initiated after Rebecca missed her scheduled satellite phone check-in, remained impossible under conditions that grounded all aircraft and made ground travel suicidal even for experienced rescue teams. Unknown to Rebecca, Dr. Whitaker had already reported her colleagues' failure to make contact, initiating formal missing person protocols. But as emergency management officials carefully explained to the worried biologist, no search could be launched until the historic storm system passed, a timeline meteorologists estimated at minimum 48 hours and potentially longer. 4. Rebecca Harlow, injured and trapped in one of the most hostile environments on the continent, conventional rescue had become impossible. Her survival now depended entirely on her own determination and the inexplicable behavior of creatures that human civilization has feared and persecuted for thousands of years. As she drifted into uneasy sleep, surrounded by the Granite Ridge pack, Rebecca had no way of knowing that her ordeal had only begun, that the storm would continue unabated for 7 more days, that her path to survival would require an unprecedented adaptation to wolf social structures, or that her eventual discovery would come through the tracking skills of a man whose ancestors had coexisted with wolves for countless generations. This extraordinary chapter in human-wildlife interaction, what would later be termed the Teton wolf miracle by media outlets, was just beginning to unfold in the unforgiving wilderness of northwestern Wyoming, far beyond the boundaries of conventional human experience. The full intensity of what meteorologists would later name the century storm descended upon the Teton Range with apocalyptic force. Weather stations throughout Wyoming failed one by one as wind gusts exceeded 90 miles per hour, severing power lines and toppling transmission towers. In Jackson Hole, emergency services responded to 27 structural collapses within the first 12 hours. Governor Mitchell declared a state emergency by noon on March 6th, mobilizing National Guard units that would ultimately remain helpless against nature's onslaught. For Rebecca Harlow, these broader impacts remained unknown, as her world narrowed to a 15-foot radius of survival space amid the hostile white chaos. The wolves' presence created a critical microclimate that meteorological experts would later calculate increased the temperature in her immediate vicinity by approximately 12 degrees, the margin between certain death and potential survival. Dawn of March 7th brought no respite from the storm, but did reveal the extent of Rebecca's predicament. During the night, snow had accumulated around the protective formation of wolf bodies, creating what Arctic researchers term a quinsy, a natural snow shelter formed by body heat, melting and then refreezing the inner snow layer. This structure, entirely coincidental, now enhanced the thermal protection. "I conducted a mental inventory of my resources," Rebecca later explained to medical personnel. "I had lost my backpack during the fall, retaining only what was in my pockets, a multi-tool knife, waterproof matches in a sealed case, 2 energy bars, and the satellite phone, which still couldn't connect due to the storm. My water bottle had frozen solid. Most critically, I had no shelter beyond what the wolves and the snow formation provided. Conventional wilderness medicine protocol would have demanded immediate medical evacuation. With core body temperature already compromised, traumatic injuries, limiting mobility and minimal supplies, survival beyond 24 to 48 hours would typically be considered impossible. Yet the unprecedented protection of the wolf pack had already altered these calculations. As morning advanced, Rebecca observed the wolves' rotating positions, the animals closest to her body moving to the perimeter while others took their place, providing direct thermal contact. This behavior, remarkably similar to how penguin colonies survive Antarctic conditions through constant position cycling, demonstrated sophisticated adaptation to extreme environments. Artemis seemed to coordinate these rotations, Rebecca noted. She would make eye contact with specific pack members, sometimes adding a subtle vocalization, not quite a whine, not quite a growl, and the indicated wolf would respond by changing position. The level of intentional coordination was extraordinary. By midday, Rebecca faced her first critical survival decision, whether to attempt movement toward potential rescue or remain within the unlikely but effective protection of the wolf-created shelter. Her wilderness training and experience argued. For staying put, movement would expend precious calories and potentially separate her from the thermal protection currently keeping her alive. The rational choice was clear, she recounted. I needed to conserve energy, prevent further heat loss, and await either improvement in conditions or rescue mobilization. But I also understood that my injuries required medical attention that might not arrive in time. This calculation was further complicated when Artemis and 3 adult wolves departed the shelter formation around noon, leaving 3 younger wolves maintaining the protective barrier. Rebecca interpreted this correctly as a hunting party departure. The pack needed to maintain its own energy reserves, which meant securing prey despite the brutal conditions. The departure of half the pack reduced the thermal protection substantially. Rebecca's core temperature, which had stabilized overnight, began dropping again, a development she monitored by tracking her mental clarity and increasing difficulty performing simple tasks like wiggling her toes within her boots. I recognized the signs of advancing hypothermia, she explained. Confusion, fumbling movements, intense shivering, followed by its concerning absence. I knew I needed to act while still capable of logical thought. Using her functioning left arm, Rebecca began excavating the snow around her to enhance the quinsy structure. The 3 remaining wolves initially watched with evident curiosity before one of the yearlings, a grey female Rebecca had previously photographed and identified by a distinctive ear notch, began mimicking her digging behavior, effectively assisting in shelter construction. This cooperative interaction represented a pivotal moment in the unfolding survival situation. Wildlife behavior experts who later reviewed Rebecca's account identified this as a remarkable instance of interspecies problem-solving, the wolf recognizing and supporting human survival behavior without obvious self-benefit. Over approximately 2 hours, Rebecca and the young wolf expanded and reinforced the snow shelter, creating a more effective wind barrier with a narrowed entrance that conserved heat while allowing air circulation. The process depleted Rebecca's limited energy reserves, but resulted in a structure that measurably improved her survival prospects. The shelter wasn't pretty or technically correct by human standards, Rebecca acknowledged, but it incorporated the essential principles: wind protection, thermal insulation, and size appropriate to the heat sources available. What made it remarkable was its hybrid nature, neither fully human nor fully wolf in design, but incorporating the survival knowledge of both species. As afternoon faded toward another dangerous night, Rebecca consumed half of 1 energy bar, carefully, rationing her minimal food supply while recognizing the need for caloric intake to maintain core temperature. The resource calculation was grim. Without additional supplies, starvation would become a competing threat to exposure within approximately 72 hours. The hunting party returned at dusk, a deep, critical moment that Rebecca later identified as her first true understanding of her incorporation into the pack's survival dynamics. Artemis and the other adults returned with remnants of an elk calf, a successful hunt despite the catastrophic conditions. Their return completed the thermal barrier around the enhanced shelter, immediately improving the microclimate. What followed defies conventional understanding of wolf behavior toward humans. Approximately 1 hour after their return, Artemis approached Rebecca with a section of the elk kill, a portion of hindquarter with exposed muscle tissue. The alpha female placed this offering at Rebecca's feet, then retreated to a watchful position several feet away. I understood immediately that this was a food offering, Rebecca explained, though whether motivated by identified need or some form of reciprocity for the shelter improvements remained impossible to determine. What was clear was that I was being included in the pack's resource distribution, a behavior normally restricted to confirmed pack members. The implications of accepting raw meat in her compromised physical condition presented Rebecca with another survival calculation. Potential pathogen exposure posed serious risk, but caloric necessity outweighed these concerns. Using her multi-tool knife, she carefully cut thin strips of the least exposed muscle tissue, consuming approximately 6 ounces of raw protein. I focused on the interior muscle, avoiding sections that had contacted snow or saliva, she explained. It wasn't a zero-risk decision, but it represented the best available option for maintaining energy reserves essential to core temperature regulation. This consumption of wolf-provided food marked Rebecca's transition from passive beneficiary of protection to active participant in the pack's survival system, a profound shift in interspecies dynamics that would characterize the extraordinary days ahead. Night brought temperature drops to -30 degrees, with wind chill approaching -60, conditions that would have been absolutely fatal without the combined protection of the improved snow shelter and the wolves' thermal barrier. The storm showed no signs of abating, with barometric pressure readings continuing to drop and snow accumulation now exceeding 4 feet throughout the region. In Jackson Hole, emergency management officials had been forced to suspend even limited search operations. Dr. Whitaker maintained a constant vigil at the Emergency Operations Center, where meteorologists now predicted storm conditions could persist for up to 10 days, far beyond the survival window for anyone caught in the backcountry without substantial shelter and supplies. "We have to assume the worst," the search coordinator had told Eleanor privately. "No one survives these conditions for multiple days. I'm sorry, but we're likely looking at a recovery operation once the storm clears." Eleanor had refused to accept this assessment. "You don't know Rebecca," she insisted. "She has skills and knowledge beyond conventional wilderness training. If anyone could find a way to survive, it's her." Unknown to the search coordinator, Dr. Whitaker, or indeed anyone in the human world attempting to calculate Rebecca's survival chances, the reality unfolding in the remote basin defied conventional analysis. The integration of human intelligence with wolf social structure and survival strategies had created an entirely unprecedented survival scenario, one that would continue to evolve in extraordinary ways. Dawn of March 8th, the third day of the storm and Rebecca's second full day with the Granite Ridge Pack, brought the first medical crisis. The physical trauma of her injuries, combined with exposure and minimal nutrition, had allowed infection to develop in her shoulder. By morning, her temperature had risen, despite the environmental cold, the unmistakable sign of developing sepsis. As eyes recognized the fever for what it was, Rebecca recounted. "Without antibiotics, systemic infection would kill me even if I survived the storm. I needed to reduce the infection load through whatever means available." Drawing on both wilderness medicine training and knowledge gleaned from anthropological readings about indigenous practices, Rebecca made another survival decision that merged human medical understanding with natural resources. She packed snow against the inflamed shoulder joint, using cold to reduce bacterial reproduction, while simultaneously opening her multi-tool to access its small blade. With the wolves watching attentively, Rebecca performed a crude but necessary drainage procedure on the infected shoulder, creating a small incision at the most inflamed point to release accumulated pus and reduce pressure on the joint. The procedure, performed with her non-dominant hand under extreme conditions, represented An extraordinary feat of self-surgery. The pain was excruciating but clarifying, she later explained. I understood that without intervention, septic shock would develop within hours. The procedure was primitive, but based on sound medical principles, drainage of infected material, to reduce bacterial load and pressure that was limiting blood flow to the joint. What followed represented perhaps the most inexplicable element of Rebecca's entire survival experience. As blood and infectious material drained from the incision, the wolf Rebecca had come to think of as the helper, the same yearling female who had assisted with shelter construction, approached and began gently licking the wound. Canine saliva contains lysozyme, an enzyme with natural antibacterial properties. This biochemical fact, while scientifically documented, doesn't explain the behavior Rebecca experienced. A wolf deliberately cleaning a human wound in what appeared to be intentional medical assistance. I didn't move away, Rebecca recalled, partially because I lacked the strength to protest, but mainly because I recognized the potential benefit. Indigenous knowledge across multiple cultures acknowledges the wound-cleaning properties of canine saliva. The behavior seemed clearly directed toward assisting my recovery. The wolf continued this treatment intermittently throughout the day, returning to clean the drainage site whenever fresh material appeared. By evening, the localized swelling had noticeably decreased, and Rebecca's fever had stabilized rather than escalating, suggesting the intervention had successfully reduced the infection load below critical threshold. This medical crisis and its unusual resolution accelerated Rebecca's psychological transformation. The boundaries between herself and the wolf pack, boundaries that human cultural conditioning establishes as absolute, began dissolving under the pressure of shared survival necessity. I began to perceive myself not as a human being assisted by wolves, but as a pack member with different capabilities, she explained. My thinking shifted from them versus me to us in relation to surviving the storm. This wasn't a philosophical choice, but a psychological adaptation to extreme circumstances. The storm's fourth day brought the first environment change since its onset, a brief 6-hour pause in snowfall, though winds continued unabated. This window allowed Rebecca to further improve the snow shelter, which now resembled a hybrid between a traditional human snow cave and a wolf den. The structure incorporated ventilation holes, a sleeping platform slightly elevated from the ground, and an entrance tunnel that minimized heat loss. The design reflected both human technical knowledge and wolf denning behavior, Rebecca noted. I incorporated elements I had observed in natural wolf dens during spring photography sessions, particularly the angled entrance tunnel that prevents direct wind entry while allowing air exchange. This construction period also marked Rebecca's first attempts at more active participation in pack communication. Drawing on her years of wolf observation, she began mimicking the subtle vocalizations and body language used between pack members. These attempts were initially met with what appeared to be confusion from the wolves, but gradually elicited recognizable responses. I started with simple communications, the low whine that indicates submission or non-threat, the ear position that communicates attention rather than aggression. These were signals I had documented during years of observation, but had never attempted to reproduce personally. By the afternoon of March 9th, a tentative communication system had developed. Rebecca could reliably signal basic needs: water, which the wolves provided by bringing mouthfuls of snow; warmth, which prompted closer physical contact from pack members; and pain, which appeared to elicit concerned attention, particularly from Artemis and the helper wolf. This rudimentary cross-species communication represented another unprecedented development in the unfolding survival situation. Rebecca was not merely benefiting from wolf protection, but actively participating in pack communication systems. a level of integration that transcended passive cooperation. The hunting party departed again that afternoon, this time including the helper wolf, while leaving Artemis and 2 other adults maintaining thermal protection around Rebecca. Their absence extended longer than the previous hunt, nearly 6 hours during which the storm resumed full intensity. Those were difficult hours, Rebecca acknowledged. The reduced thermal protection allowed my core temperature to drop again, and I experienced periods of confusion and disorientation consistent with advancing hypothermia. I focused on small survival tasks to maintain consciousness, reorganizing the sleeping platform, checking my remaining supplies, practicing controlled breathing to minimize rib pain. When the hunting party returned shortly after nightfall, they brought another successful kill, portions of mountain goat that provided additional calories for both wolves and human. Rebecca's participation in the shared meal further cemented her integration into the pack's resource distribution system. That night, her 4th with the wolf pack, represented a psychological turning point in Rebecca's experience. As the storm reached new intensity, with wind gusts exceeding 100 miles per hour, the entire pack pressed close around her within the enhanced shelter, creating maximum thermal protection against the killing cold. I experienced a profound sense of acceptance, she later wrote. Not just tolerance of my presence, but active incorporation into the pack's survival priority. I was being protected with the same attention that would be given to wolf pups during environmental threats. This integration coincided with what medical experts later identified as the most physically vulnerable period of Rebecca's ordeal. The combination of traumatic injury, limited nutrition, and prolonged exposure had depleted her physiological reserves to critical levels. Without the wolves' continued protection, survival beyond this point would have been physiologically impossible, regardless of her mental determination or survival knowledge. By the morning of March 10th, the 5th day of the storm and Rebecca's 4th full day with the Granite Ridge Pack, her condition had paradoxically stabilized despite the continuing environmental extremity. The infection in her shoulder had noticeably receded. Her body temperature had established a new baseline, approximately 1 degree below normal, and her caloric intake through shared kills was sufficient to prevent critical metabolic collapse. I had entered a different physiological state, she explained. Not healthy by any conventional standard, but adapted to the extreme conditions through a combination of human physiological resilience and the microenvironment created by wolf body, heat and shelter protection. This adaptation allowed Rebecca to assume a more active role within the pack dynamic. She began participating in shelter maintenance, used snow to clean the feeding area, and even assisted with grooming behaviors, using her functioning left hand to remove ice formations from the fur of wolves who had rotated into the shelter from perimeter duty. These weren't conscious attempts to reciprocate care, Rebecca clarified. They emerged naturally from the psychological shift I had undergone, from seeing myself as a human victim of circumstance to a functioning pack member with different capabilities but shared survival goals. This transformation reached its most profound expression on the evening of March 10th, when Rebecca found herself instinctively joining the pack's twilight howl, a vocalization that wolves typically use for territorial signaling and pack cohesion. Without conscious decision, she added her human voice to the wolves' communication in what she later described as the most natural action I had ever taken. The wolves' response to this participation was extraordinary. Rather than showing confusion or aversion to the human vocalization, they adjusted their howling to accommodate Rebecca's different vocal range, creating a unified sound that incorporated both species' communication patterns. At that moment, I understood something fundamental about survival that transcends species boundaries, Rebecca explained. When facing environmental threats that exceed individual capacity, cooperation and integration become not just beneficial but essential. The pack survived because they functioned as a unified system rather than as individuals, and they had incorporated me into that system. As the unified howl echoed through the storm-ravaged basin, Rebecca Harlow had completed a transformation unprecedented in documented human-wildlife interaction. She had moved beyond benefiting from wolf protection or mimicking wolf behavior to active participation in wolf social structures, a level of cross-species integration that would later challenge fundamental assumptions about the barriers between human and animal consciousness. Unknown to Rebecca, this remarkable adaptation would soon face its greatest test. The storm was finally beginning to weaken, and with improving conditions, human search efforts would soon resume. The approach of other humans would force Rebecca to navigate between the wolf world that had saved her life and the human world, to which she technically belonged. And one particular human was already preparing to track the Granite Ridge Pack through the storm's aftermath. A man whose understanding of wolves rivaled Rebecca's own, but emerged from a completely different cultural tradition and generational knowledge base. Thomas Blackfeather, Shoshone guide and wildlife specialist contracted by Grand Teton National Park for the search operation, was studying maps of the region and preparing specialized tracking equipment as the storm began its slow dissipation. His approach to finding Rebecca would draw on 15 generations of indigenous knowledge about wolf behavior, knowledge that would lead him to expect everything except what he would actually discover. By March 12th, the 7th day of Rebecca's ordeal, the historic storm finally began to dissipate. Barometric pressure stabilized. Wind speeds gradually decreased to under 30 miles per hour, and periodic breaks in cloud cover allowed brief glimpses of sunlight. Meteorologists later classified the system as a 1,000-year storm event, with snowfall totals exceeding 11 feet in higher elevations. For Rebecca Harlow, these improving conditions brought mixed implications. The reduced environmental threat improved immediate survival prospects, but also meant she would need to make decisions about attempting self-rescue versus continuing to shelter with the wolf pack that had kept her alive through conditions that had claimed lives even in protected settings. The transition wasn't immediately apparent, Rebecca later explained. The wolves sensed the atmospheric changes before I detected them visually. Their behavior shifted, less hunched positioning, more alert head movements, increased attention to sounds that could now travel without being immediately dispersed by hurricane-force winds. This environmental reprieve allowed Rebecca to conduct her first thorough self-assessment since the initial injury. Her medical condition presented a complex picture. The shoulder infection had substantially improved following the drainage procedure and subsequent wound cleaning by the helper wolf, but the joint remained essentially immobilized. Her fractured ribs had begun early healing, evidenced by decreased pain during normal breathing, though deep breaths or sudden movements still produced intense discomfort. Most concerning was her overall physical deterioration. Despite the protein provided through shared kills, Rebecca had lost approximately 20 pounds of body mass, weight she couldn't afford to lose from her already lean frame. Muscle atrophy from inactivity compounded this weakness, particularly in her legs, which had remained largely immobile during the shelter-in-place survival strategy. I realized that even with improving weather, I lacked the physical capacity to self-rescue, she acknowledged. The nearest trail access point was approximately 4 miles from my location, an impossible distance given my weakened condition and the thigh-deep snow. This physical reality cemented her continued dependence on the wolf pack for survival. Transitioning from emergency weather protection to a more sustainable integration pattern became her new focus, a shift that required deeper understanding of pack dynamics and her role within them. Rebecca began systematically observing the social hierarchy that governed pack interactions. Artemis maintained a clear alpha position. With an older male, Rebecca had previously named Atlas in her research. Notes, functioning as her primary lieutenant. Below them operated a complex secondary structure among the 8 other adult and subadult wolves, with position apparently determined by a combination of age, size, hunting ability, and what Rebecca could only describe as individual personality characteristics. The pack structure wasn't the simplified alpha, beta, omega hierarchy described in older wildlife literature, she noted. It functioned more as a fluid, specialized system, with different wolves assuming leadership roles depending on the specific activity and conditions. What remained consistent was Artemis's ultimate decision-making authority, particularly regarding resource distribution and territory movement. Understanding her own position within this social framework became critical to Rebecca's adaptation strategy. Through careful observation, she determined that the pack had categorized her in a status similar to an injured subadult, deserving protection and resource sharing while not expected to contribute to primary hunting activities. I was neither treated as an outsider nor as a full adult pack member, she explained. My closest analogue was perhaps an adolescent wolf recovering from injury, worth investing pack resources in because of future contribution potential, but currently operating under different behavioral expectations. This social positioning created both benefits and challenges. Rebecca received continued thermal protection, shared food resources, and assistance with wound management. However, as weather conditions improved, the pack's activity patterns naturally shifted toward more extensive territory monitoring and hunting operations, activities that would require her to either move with the pack or risk separation from her survival support system. The morning of March 13th brought this challenge into sharp focus. Shortly after dawn, Artemis initiated clear pre-movement signals, vocalizations and body language that Rebecca had documented during prior research as indicating imminent territory movement. The wolves began systematically circling outward from the shelter location, marking boundaries and investigating conditions in expanding radius patterns. I understood we would be leaving the shelter site, Rebecca explained. The pack needed to properly assess territory conditions following the storm, locate new hunting opportunities based on changed prey movement patterns, and potentially respond to adjacent pack encroachments during the weather disruption. This realization forced critical decisions about her capacity for movement. Testing showed her left leg could bear weight reasonably well, but her right leg had developed concerning numbness from extended immobility in cold conditions. The dislocated shoulder and fractured ribs severely limited upper body strength and balance compensation. Standing unassisted required extreme effort. Walking presented even greater challenges. What followed demonstrated remarkable adaptation on both sides of the human-wolf relationship. As Rebecca struggled to stand, Artemis approached and positioned herself against Rebecca's left side, providing structural support, similar to how wolves sometimes assist injured pack members. The helper wolf, whom Rebecca had begun mentally calling Adara, similarly braced her right side, creating a living crutch system. Their support wasn't perfect, Rebecca acknowledged, but it allowed a mobility level I couldn't have achieved independently. We developed a halting 3-entity movement system, with my steps coordinated between their bracing positions. This assisted mobility, while far slower than normal wolf travel pace, allowed Rebecca to remain with the pack as they began post-storm territory assessment. The wolves adjusted their movement rate to accommodate her limitations, a behavioral adaptation that wildlife biologists later identified as extraordinary evidence of intentional interspecies cooperation. The day's movement covered approximately 1 mile in total, a distance that alternately exhausted and invigorated Rebecca. Despite the physical strain, the activity began reversing muscle atrophy and improved circulation to her extremities, reducing the numbness that had threatened. Developing frostbite. Moving again, even in this limited fashion, provided critical physiological benefits, she explained. Static survival in extreme cold creates cumulative tissue damage through restricted circulation. Regular movement, even painful movement, helps prevent that progressive deterioration. The pack's territory survey revealed dramatic landscape transformation from the storm. Entire stands of pine had collapsed under snow load, creating new physical barriers and altering wildlife movement corridors. Avalanche tracks scarred previously forested slopes, depositing debris fields across former game trails. Most significantly, for immediate survival needs, ungulate populations had concentrated in sheltered valleys where forage remained partially accessible. Rebecca observed the wolves processing these environmental changes through systematic sensory assessment, scent, marking, visual scanning, soil and snow texture evaluation through paw testing. What emerged was a comprehensive environmental analysis that guided subsequent movement decisions toward optimal resource areas. Their environmental assessment wasn't just instinctive, Rebecca noted. It represented sophisticated information, processing that incorporated multiple sensory inputs, memory comparison against pre-storm conditions, and projective calculation about prey behavior under altered circumstances. The wolves' analysis led the pack to a protected valley, approximately 2 miles from the original shelter site. Here, a combination of terrain features had created a relatively hospitable microclimate, reduced snow depth from wind scouring, southern exposure providing marginally warmer temperatures, and critically, a concentration of mule deer forced into the area by surrounding inhospitable conditions. This location became the pack's new operational center, with Rebecca integrated into the adapted survival pattern. The wolves quickly established a modified den structure using a windfall pine as primary support, with snow-cleared ground beneath its elevated root system. This natural formation, enhanced through wolf-digging behavior, created what Rebecca described as a hybrid shelter incorporating both wolf-denning architecture and human survival shelter principles. The improved location and shelter structure allowed Rebecca to focus on rehabilitation rather than mere survival. Using techniques adapted from wilderness medicine protocols, she began aggressive physical therapy, moving each joint through progressive range-of-motion exercises, massaging compromised muscle groups to improve circulation, and attempting increasingly demanding physical tasks to rebuild strength. I established a rehabilitation schedule that mirrored the wolves' activity cycles, she explained. During their active periods, primarily dawn, dusk, and night, I would maintain position within the shelter, conserving energy. During daylight, rest periods, when most of the pack was sleeping, I would perform rehabilitation exercises and gradually expand my independent mobility range. This rehabilitation strategy yielded progressive improvements. By March 15th, Rebecca could stand unassisted for short periods. By March 17th, she could walk approximately 50 yards independently before requiring rest. The dislocated shoulder remained her most significant physical limitation, but even this injury showed marginal improvement through careful movement and continued wound management. The wolves' hunting success during this period proved crucial to Rebecca's physical recovery. The concentration of mule deer in the valley created optimal hunting conditions, with the pack successfully bringing down prey every 36 to 48 hours. This regular protein source, coupled with melted snow for hydration, provided the nutritional foundation necessary for tissue repair and strength rebuilding. Rebecca's participation in these communal feeds evolved as her physical capabilities improved. Initially dependent on what the wolves directly provided, she gradually began participating in meat processing, using her multi-tool knife to separate portions from the kills, creating jerky through sun-drying techniques when weather permitted, and developing a rudimentary storage system for preserving excess meat between hunts. "I wasn't just passively receiving food anymore," she noted. "I was actively contributing to its processing and preservation, which seemed to modify my status within the pack hierarchy." The wolves, Artemis particularly, appeared to recognize this contribution as valuable, evidenced by their allowance of my earlier access during feeding, rather than waiting until dominant members had finished. This status evolution extended to other aspects of pack dynamics. By the third week of March, Rebecca had been incorporated into territory patrol rotations, accompanying Artemis and varying subgroups of wolves during systematic boundary monitoring. Though her mobility remained compromised, her visual acuity and different sensory focus provided complementary monitoring capabilities. I could detect certain environmental elements the wolves might miss, distant human activity beyond their scent range, for instance, or visual identification of aircraft that represented potential search operations. This created a genuine mutualistic relationship rather than one-sided dependence. March 20th marked 2 weeks since Rebecca's initial storm encounter with the wolves and brought the first potential contact with human search efforts. A helicopter briefly appeared at the northern edge of visible range, conducting what was clearly a grid search pattern before disappearing beyond the ridgeline. This sighting forced Rebecca to confront the approaching decision point, whether to attempt signaling to human rescuers or continue within the pack structure that had ensured her survival. The choice wasn't simple. Her physical condition, while improved, remained precarious by conventional medical standards. The helicopter's brief appearance suggested search patterns hadn't yet reached her current location. Most significantly, she had developed what anthropologists would later term adaptive integration with the wolf pack, a functional place within their social structure that provided mutual benefit. "I experienced genuine ambivalence," Rebecca acknowledged. "Rational analysis dictated that human medical care represented my best long-term survival outcome. But I had developed a connection to the pack that transcended logical calculation, particularly with Artemis and Adara, who had directly intervened to save my life multiple times. This emotional complexity was compounded by practical considerations. Any rescue would inevitably attract attention to the Granite Ridge pack, potentially threatening their relative isolation from human interference that had preserved their natural behavior patterns." Rebecca's extensive documentation of their unique social characteristics had significant scientific value, but could also make them targets for increased research intrusion. "I made the decision to delay active signaling," she explained. "Not permanently, but until I had regained sufficient physical capability to properly document the extraordinary interspecies cooperation I had experienced. This wasn't motivated by personal benefit, but by recognition of the unprecedented scientific and conservation value of what had occurred." This decision initiated what Rebecca later termed the documentation phase of her experience. Using the small waterproof notebook that had remained in her pocket throughout the ordeal, she began systematically recording observations about wolf social structure, communication patterns, resource management, and most significantly, their apparent cognitive flexibility in incorporating a human into pack dynamics. Her notes detailed specific behaviors that contradicted established scientific understanding of wolf-human interaction. The wolves' initial decision to provide thermal protection rather than avoid human contact. their food-sharing behavior across species boundaries, their adaptation of movement patterns to accommodate her physical limitations, and perhaps most remarkably, their apparent recognition of complementary capabilities she contributed to collective survival. These observations have profound implications for our understanding of animal cognition, Rebecca wrote. The behaviors I've documented suggest capacity for cross-species empathy, recognition of differentiated capabilities between species, and cognitive flexibility in social structure that exceeds current scientific consensus about canid psychology. As March progressed toward April, Rebecca continued physical rehabilitation alongside scientific documentation. By month's end, she could walk nearly a quarter-mile without support, manage small game preparation using both hands with limited pain, and contribute meaningfully to collective survival through her different capabilities. The wolves, meanwhile, adjusted their behavior patterns to seasonal transition. With spring approaching, their movements expanded into higher territories as snowmelt improved access. The female wolves, including Artemis and Adara, began exhibiting early reproductive behavior signals. Territory marking focused on potential, denning sites, increased dominance assertion, and subtle physiological changes that Rebecca recognized from prior research. I understood that major pack structure changes were approaching with the spring breeding cycle, Rebecca noted. This would potentially alter my position within the social hierarchy, especially as pregnant females establish priority resource access. This recognition coincided with improving conditions for potential rescue. Snow depth had decreased sufficiently to make ground-based search operations possible in many areas. Helicopter activity had increased throughout the region, and Rebecca's physical condition had stabilized to the point where separation from the pack no longer represented immediate life threat. By early April, I had documented the essential elements of this unprecedented human-wolf interaction, she explained. I had experienced something extraordinary, genuine incorporation into a wild wolf pack for survival purposes, and had created sufficient documentation to ensure scientific recognition of its significance. April 4th brought the decision point. Into unavoidable focus, morning patrol activities with Artemis and 2 other wolves took them to an elevated ridge with clear views across the basin. From this vantage, Rebecca spotted unmistakable evidence of organized human activity. A search base camp established approximately 3 miles southeast of their location, with visible personnel movement and equipment deployment. The wolves registered this human presence immediately, their body language shifting to alert assessment. Artemis particularly exhibited focused attention, alternating her gaze between the distant human activity and Rebecca in what appeared to be direct connection-making between the observed humans and her human pack member. It was a moment of extraordinary communication, Rebecca recalled. Artemis seemed to recognize that these distant humans represented my original social group. Her posture and eye contact communicated what I can only describe as a question, whether I would remain with the pack or return to my own kind. This moment crystallized the approaching transition. The wolves' reproductive cycle would soon necessitate pack restructuring around denning activities. Human search operations were finally reaching their operational area. Rebecca's physical condition, while far from fully recovered, had stabilized beyond immediate survival threat. The extraordinary cross-species integration had reached its natural conclusion point. The decision formed with unexpected clarity. Rebecca needed to return to human society, not only for medical treatment, but to share the unprecedented scientific documentation of interspecies cooperation she had accumulated. The wolves, particularly the females approaching reproductive phase, needed to progress through their natural life cycle without human presence, potentially disrupting denning and pup rearing. I made the decision to initiate contact with the search operation, Rebecca explained. Not by leaving the wolves immediately, but by creating signal markers that would draw searchers toward our location in a controlled manner that would allow the wolves sufficient time to retreat from direct human contact. Using her knife and materials gathered from their surroundings, Rebecca created visibility markers on 3 prominent landscape features. Arrangements that were clearly artificial and would attract searcher attention without requiring her physical presence at the sites. These markers incorporated directional indicators leading toward, but not directly to, the wolves' current territorial center. This approach reflected Rebecca's determined protection of the wolf pack that had saved her life. She would facilitate her own rescue, but in a manner that minimized potential negative impact on the Granite Ridge pack, particularly avoiding having search personnel directly encounter the wolves and potentially misinterpreting their behavior toward her. What Rebecca couldn't anticipate was that the search operation had recently incorporated a specialist whose understanding of wolf behavior nearly matched her own, though derived from entirely different knowledge traditions. Thomas Blackfeather, whose Shoshone ancestors had coexisted with wolf populations for countless generations, had been specifically contracted to track the Granite Ridge pack based on Dr. Whitaker's theory that Rebecca might have encountered them during her survival attempt. This impending convergence between a woman who had lived among wolves and a man who understood them through ancestral knowledge would complete the extraordinary narrative that had begun in catastrophic conditions and evolved into unprecedented cross-species cooperation. Their meeting would bridge different knowledge systems about the same remarkable animals, creating the foundation for what would eventually become groundbreaking wildlife conservation methodology. As Rebecca completed her signal markers and returned to the wolf pack's current location, she was unaware that Thomas had already identified evidence of her presence with the wolves, a tracking discovery that defied his expectations and would lead him directly toward the most significant wildlife encounter of his 30-year career. Thomas Blackfeather moved through the wilderness with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent more lifetime hours off-trail than on. At 48, his lean frame showed the physical conditioning of constant outdoor activity, while the lines etched around his eyes spoke to decades squinting against mountain sun, wind, and snow. As the Wyoming Department of Fish and Wildlife's most experienced indigenous liaison and a contracted guide for Grand Teton National Park, Thomas brought unique capabilities to the search for Rebecca Harlow. "You track differently than the others," observed Carl Mitchell, the search coordinator, who had initially doubted Thomas's unorthodox methodology. Rather than following strict grid patterns with his assigned team, Thomas had immediately broken protocol upon discovering the first wolf tracks, following what he termed relationship patterns rather than direct evidence of human presence. "I'm tracking a relationship, not just a person," Thomas had explained when questioned about his approach. "If Dr. Whitaker's theory is correct and Ms. Harlow encountered the Granite Ridge pack, we're not looking for separate tracks that occasionally intersect. We're looking for evidence of interaction, how movement patterns change when different species travel together." This conceptual framework drew from generations of Shoshone tracking tradition, where animals were understood not as isolated entities, but as participants in a dynamic ecological network. Thomas's grandfather, Joseph Blackfeather, had taught him to recognize these relationship signatures beginning at age 7, when they tracked lynx through winter snow, not by following obvious prints, but by identifying subtle changes in prey, movement patterns around the predator's territory. The search for Rebecca had transformed on April 2nd when Thomas discovered the first concrete evidence supporting Dr. Whitaker's theory, a series of unusual wolf bed depressions in what had clearly been a temporary shelter location. The configuration defied conventional wolf resting patterns, with positions arranged in an inward-facing circle around a central area that showed evidence of human presence. Fabric fibers, a small blood spot with human DNA later confirmed through field testing, and most significantly, the impression of a human body surrounded by wolf forms. They were sheltering her, Thomas had stated with quiet certainty when the forensic technician questioned his interpretation. This formation is heat-sharing behavior, something wolves do with vulnerable pack members during extreme weather. Except the protected individual in this case was human. This discovery had transformed the search operation. What had been a presumed recovery mission shifted to an active rescue with renewed urgency. If wolves had indeed protected Rebecca rather than avoided or threatened her, survival beyond normal human endurance in the historic storm became plausible. The operation expanded, with additional personnel and resources deployed to the basin where Thomas had identified this first concrete evidence. Now, 2 days later, Thomas followed a set of indicators that conventional tracking would have overlooked entirely. Rather than focusing solely on footprints or disturbed vegetation, he observed subtle behavioral traces, changes in wolf movement patterns that suggested accommodation of a mobility-impaired companion, feeding sites with evidence of both wolf and human processing of the same prey. And most tellingly, what Thomas recognized as intentional communication markers combining wolf territorial signaling with human directional indicators. "She's communicating with them and through them," he explained to the skeptical state wildlife biologist accompanying him. "These aren't random overlapping marks. They're deliberate combinations, human directional intent expressed through frameworks. Wolves would understand and reinforce with their own territorial marking." The biologist remained unconvinced until they discovered the first intentional signal marker Rebecca had created, a distinctive arrangement of branches forming an arrow shape, supplemented with wolf territorial scratch marks that had been deliberately preserved rather than obscured. The human-wolf communication hybrid was unmistakable to anyone with sufficient knowledge of both species' signaling methods. "This changes everything we understand about interspecies communication potential," the biologist acknowledged, documenting the marker with multiple photographs. "She's not just surviving alongside them, she's developed a functional communication system with wild wolves." Thomas recognized even more in the markers than his scientific colleague perceived. The specific placement, orientation, and materials used in Rebecca's signals incorporated elements reflecting indigenous communication principles, methods similar to those his ancestors had used for environmental navigation and storytelling. Through arranged natural materials, she's drawing from multiple knowledge systems, Thomas noted, combining conventional hiking signals with wolf territorial patterns and what appears to be intuitive rediscovery of indigenous marker methodology. It's an adaptive hybrid communication system. Following these markers led Thomas to increasingly fresh evidence of Rebecca's presence. By mid-afternoon on April 5th, tracking indicators suggested they were less than 2 hours behind her current location. Radio reports from other search teams confirmed no other contact or sightings, cementing Thomas's track analysis as the most promising route to potential rescue. As evening approached, Thomas made a decision that contradicted standard search protocols, but aligned with his understanding of wolf-human dynamics. He separated from the biologist and other team members, instructing them to establish a perimeter position while he continued alone. Current protocols would require approaching with multiple personnel, potentially creating threat perception for both the wolves and Ms. Harlow, he explained to the operation coordinator via radio. If she's developed the relationship these signs suggest, an individual approach by someone with wolf behavior understanding presents the lowest risk scenario for all involved. After initial resistance, Search Command reluctantly approved Thomas's approach, with conditions including continuous radio contact and satellite tracking of his location. Accompanied only by basic medical supplies, emergency provisions, and his lifetime of wolf behavior knowledge, Thomas proceeded toward what tracking indicators suggested was a recent rest location used by the pack and Rebecca. As shadows lengthened, across the basin, Thomas detected the subtle shift in wildlife behavior patterns that always signaled wolf presence. Birds falling silent in sequential pattern rather than simultaneously, small mammals retreating to protective cover in coordinated waves rather than random movement. These indicators confirmed he was approaching an active wolf location, likely with recent or current occupation. Approximately 500 yards from the projected site, Thomas initiated the approach protocol his grandfather had taught him for wolf encounters, not attempting concealment, impossible when approaching canids with acute sensory capabilities, but rather telegraphing presence through deliberate movement patterns that communicated non-threatening intent. Wolves don't expect humans to behave like wolves, his grandfather had explained during Thomas's childhood training. They expect us to behave like predators or threats. When you move differently than either category, you create cognitive space for them to assess you as something else. This approach methodology had served Thomas during countless wolf encounters throughout his career, allowing close observation without triggering defensive or avoidance responses. Now he employed these same techniques, but with adjustment for the unprecedented scenario of approaching wolves with apparent human integration. His modified approach incorporated softer footfalls, periodic pauses with lowered body position, and subtle vocalizations in the register between speech and wolf communication sounds. These techniques aimed to signal his awareness of wolf social protocols while maintaining human identity, a bridge position that mirrored what tracking evidence suggested Rebecca had developed with the pack. The strategy yielded immediate confirmation. When a yearling male wolf appeared briefly on a ridgeline approximately 200 yards ahead, observed Thomas for approximately 30 seconds, then retreated without alarm vocalization. This sentinel behavior, assessment without immediate threat response, suggested the pack had indeed developed atypical reaction patterns to human presence through their interaction with Rebecca. Thomas maintained his measured approach, now confident. He was on the correct vector, but increasingly careful to move in a manner that communicated respectful intention rather than pursuit. As he crested a small rise overlooking a protected hollow formed by fallen timber and rock outcropping, the extraordinary scene finally came into view. The Granite Ridge Pack, 9 wolves visible from his position, had established a temporary rest location in the hollow. Their positioning formed a rough semicircle around a central figure unmistakably human, despite the significant adaptations evident in her appearance and posture. Rebecca Harlow sat with her back against a boulder, one leg extended awkwardly, while using her functional left hand to separate what appeared to be dried meat portions, distributing them to the nearest wolves in what was clearly an established routine. Thomas froze in position, not from fear, but from recognition of the scene's significance. What he observed wasn't a hostage situation, human tolerance, or even unusual habituation. The integrated positioning, casual proximity, and coordinated resource sharing represented genuine social incorporation, Rebecca functioning within wolf social structure rather than alongside it. I've approached thousands of wildlife interactions. Professionally, Thomas later reported, including sustained wolf observation sessions lasting weeks. But I had never witnessed anything resembling this level of behavioral integration between species. She moved like them, distributed food using their protocols, and most strikingly, they deferred to her sequential decisions about resource allocation. The alpha female, Artemis, though Thomas wouldn't learn her name until later, was the first to detect his presence. Her head lifted in smooth alertness rather than alarmed reaction, nostrils flaring as she processed his scent, carried on the light, evening breeze. Her subsequent behavior defied conventional wolf response patterns to human presence. Rather than initiating either defensive positioning or retreat coordination, Artemis stood and made direct eye contact with Thomas, then shifted her gaze pointedly toward Rebecca before returning attention to the observer. This triangulated communication, connecting observer, observed human, and wolf through intentional eye movement, represented what wildlife communication experts would later term referential signaling across species boundaries. Rebecca registered Artemis's alertness and followed her gaze, noticing Thomas for the first time. Her reaction revealed volumes about her psychological adaptation during the ordeal. Rather than showing immediate relief or attempting to distance herself from the wolves, she first placed a reassuring hand on Artemis's shoulder, then made a subtle gesture toward the pack that Thomas recognized as a hold position signal similar to what lead wolves use during hunting coordination. Only after stabilizing the pack's response did Rebecca acknowledge Thomas directly, raising her left hand in a universal greeting gesture while maintaining physical contact with Artemis, effectively bridging communication between human and wolf social systems. Thomas responded with the approach continuation protocol his grandfather had taught him, lowering his body profile to reduce perceived threat, establishing diagonal rather than direct movement toward the group, and maintaining slow, visible hand movements that wolves could track and assess as non-threatening. She recognized what I was doing immediately, Thomas later recalled. Her face showed first surprise, then understanding. She realized I was communicating through wolf behavioral protocols rather than standard human approach patterns. This recognition created an unexpected connection between rescuer and rescued. Both had developed means of communicating with wolves through different knowledge paths. Rebecca through direct immersion and adaptation, Thomas through cultural knowledge transmission across generations. Their shared capability created an immediate bridge that transcended the strangeness of the situation. "You know them," Rebecca said when Thomas reached conversational distance, her first words to another human in 32 days. Her voice carried the raspiness of disuse and the careful pacing of someone who had been communicating through non-verbal means for an extended period. "I know wolves," Thomas confirmed, maintaining a non-threatening position approximately 15 feet from the integrated group. "My people have lived alongside them for thousands of years. I'm Thomas Blackfeather, Shoshone guide with the search operation. Dr. Whitaker has been looking for you since the storm hit." Rebecca processed this information with visible effort, as if translating between different cognitive frameworks. "Eleanor kept searching," she stated rather than asked, the concept reconnecting her to human relationship patterns that had receded during her wolf immersion. "She never stopped," Thomas confirmed. "Insisted you might have survived when others calculated it impossible. She's the one who suggested you might have encountered this pack based on your research location." Throughout this exchange, the wolves maintained their positions, oriented toward Rebecca with occasional assessment glances toward Thomas. Their behavior pattern was neither defensive nor fearful, but rather reminded Thomas of wolf response to unfamiliar but non-threatening wolf visitors from adjacent territories, alert assessment without immediate categorization as threat. "They saved me," Rebecca stated simply, her hand still resting on Artemis's shoulder. "During the storm, after I was injured, they created shelter, shared food, helped treat infection, integrated me into their social structure." Thomas nodded, processing both her words and the extraordinary behavioral evidence before him. "You've documented this?" he asked, noticing the small notebook partially visible in her jacket pocket. "Everything," Rebecca confirmed. behavior patterns, communication development, resource-sharing protocols, adaptation to human presence. It contradicts almost everything currently accepted about wolf-human interaction potential. This exchange focused on scientific documentation, rather than immediate rescue logistics, reflected the unique nature of the situation. Both Rebecca and Thomas recognized they were witnessing something unprecedented in documented human-wildlife interaction. Behavior that challenged fundamental assumptions about species barriers and cognitive limitations. The practical aspects of rescue couldn't be postponed indefinitely, however. Thomas conducted a preliminary medical assessment from his position, noting Rebecca's obvious injuries, weight loss, and mobility limitations. "Your shoulder needs immediate medical attention," he observed, "and from your breathing pattern I suspect rib damage. The search base has a medical evacuation helicopter available. We need to get you to treatment facilities." Rebecca's face showed the first evidence of distress since Thomas's arrival. "The wolves," she said, glancing at the pack surrounding her. "Helicopter approach would be traumatic for them, and I'm concerned about how this will be reported, what it might mean for the pack if their behavior becomes widely known." Her priorities revealed profound ethical development through her experience, concern for the wolves' welfare taking precedence over her own medical needs. This alignment with wolf protection rather than self-interest demonstrated the depth of her psychological integration with the pack. Thomas recognized both the legitimacy of her concern and the necessity of medical intervention. "I can help with both issues," he assured her. "I work with the Park Service and State Wildlife Division to protect wolf populations. We can control the narrative, ensure their behavior is properly contextualized rather than sensationalized. As for approach, there's a meadow half a mile south where helicopter landing wouldn't directly impact their territory." Rebecca considered, this visibly weighing options with the methodical assessment of someone accustomed to survival-level decision-making. "We'll need to move carefully," she finally determined. "Artemis and the others will follow at distance. It's an established movement pattern when we approach areas with human scent presence. But rapid movement or multiple humans would trigger protective response." Thomas nodded, recognizing she was sharing critical safety information rather than expressing reluctance. "I came alone specifically to prevent an overwhelming approach," he explained. "The rest of the search team is maintaining a perimeter position. A mile out, we can establish a controlled movement plan toward the evacuation point." What followed was perhaps the most remarkable rescue evacuation in search and rescue history, though the full details wouldn't become public until years later, protected by both Rebecca's careful information management and Thomas's conservation ethics. Rather than a conventional extraction, with medical personnel approaching the subject, Rebecca initiated a cooperative departure from the wolf group, a process that incorporated both human medical necessities and wolf social protocols. She spoke directly to the wolves, particularly Artemis and the helper wolf Adara, using a combination of English words, wolf-like vocalizations, and body language that communicated what Thomas recognized as transition messaging, signals wolves use when pack members separate for functional purposes but maintain social bonds. "You understand what she's doing," Thomas observed, as Rebecca completed this extraordinary farewell. "Not completely," Rebecca acknowledged, "but I've learned their departure and movement coordination patterns. They recognize I'm leaving with another human, not under threat, but through choice. The conceptual framework exists within their social understanding. Pack members sometimes separate temporarily for functional reasons." With Thomas providing physical support for her injured shoulder and compromised mobility, Rebecca began moving slowly toward the evacuation point. As she had predicted, Artemis and several other wolves followed at a distance of approximately 50 yards. not approaching directly, but maintaining visual connection through coordinated parallel movement. This escort behavior continued until they reached the perimeter where other search personnel waited. At this transition point, Rebecca turned and made one final communication gesture toward the wolf pack, a vocalization Thomas recognized as incorporating elements of wolf contact howls used to maintain connection during necessary separation. Artemis responded with a single answering howl before turning and loping back toward the waiting pack members. The farewell, while incomprehensible to the watching search personnel, represented clear communication closure to both Rebecca and Thomas. Acknowledgement of transition rather than abandonment. They'll move higher into the backcountry now, Rebecca noted as medical personnel approached with a transport litter. Spring denning season is beginning. Artemis and at least 2 other females are pregnant. They need isolation during whelping and early pup development. Her knowledge of the pack's reproductive status and behavioral needs further confirmed the depth of her integration during the 32-day ordeal. Even as human medical protocols enveloped her, Rebecca's awareness remained partially aligned with wolf priorities and requirements, a psychological orientation that would present both challenges and opportunities during her impending reintegration to human society. As the medical evacuation helicopter lifted from the mountain meadow, carrying Rebecca toward comprehensive treatment in Jackson Hole, Thomas Blackfeather remained briefly at the extraction site, watching the distant wolf forms retreat into the high country wilderness. The intersection of knowledge systems he had witnessed, Rebecca's immersive adaptation alongside his own indigenous understanding of wolf behavior, represented something profound about human-wildlife relationship potential. This convergence would eventually form the foundation for an entirely new approach to wildlife conservation methodology. But in the immediate moment, it simply confirmed what Thomas's grandfather had taught him from earliest childhood, that the boundaries between human and animal consciousness were far more permeable than Western science had traditionally acknowledged, and that survival sometimes depended on the wisdom to move between worlds that most humans perceived as irrevocably separate. The Jackson Hole Medical Center erupted into coordinated chaos when Rebecca Harlow's helicopter touched down on the rooftop. Landing pad. A specialized trauma team had assembled based on the preliminary assessment transmitted from the field. Severe shoulder injury with potential sepsis risk, multiple rib fractures, significant malnutrition, exposure-related tissue damage, and possible psychological trauma from extended isolation and wildlife proximity. What the medical team hadn't prepared for was a patient who responded to their approach with wolf-like assessment behaviors, head tilted at the characteristic canid, evaluation angle, body positioned for potential retreat, and micro-expressions reflecting territorial defense rather than relief at medical intervention. "She's processing us through unfamiliar frameworks," explained Dr. Caroline West, the emergency physician who recognized the behavioral indicators from her previous work with disaster survivors experiencing acute adaptation syndrome. Standard. Approach protocols will escalate her stress response. We need modified contact methodology. This insightful assessment led to immediate adjustment in treatment approach. Rather than the standard trauma team configuration with multiple personnel simultaneously addressing different systems, Dr. West established a sequential contact protocol, individual providers approaching one at a time with clear communication about intended actions and extended processing time between interventions. The approach was counterintuitive for emergency medicine, where simultaneous multi-system assessment is standard procedure, Dr. West later explained to medical colleagues. But Ms. Harlow's neurocognitive patterns had clearly adapted to wolf social interaction frameworks, where sequential rather than simultaneous assessment is the norm. We had to meet her processing requirements rather than imposing standard protocols that would trigger defensive responses. This modified approach succeeded in establishing medical access while minimizing psychological stress. Rebecca gradually allowed increasingly invasive assessment and treatment interventions, though she maintained vigilant observational patterns throughout, tracking each provider's movements with the heightened situational awareness characteristic of prey-adapted species rather than the selective attention patterns typical of humans in secure environments. Initial medical assessment confirmed field observations while revealing additional concerns. The dislocated shoulder had developed significant secondary rotator cuff damage, requiring surgical intervention. The fractured ribs showed early healing, but with misalignment that would potentially restrict lung capacity if not corrected. Most significantly, Rebecca had lost nearly 28 pounds, approximately 22% of her pre-incident body weight, and showed severe muscle atrophy in her lower extremities. Beyond these physical conditions, blood chemistry analysis revealed extraordinary metabolic adaptations. Rebecca had developed significantly elevated red blood cell counts, similar to high-altitude adaptation, dramatically increased vitamin D synthesis efficiency despite minimal sun exposure, and perhaps most remarkably, altered thyroid function that had effectively down-regulated her basal metabolic rate. She essentially reprogrammed her physiology to survive extended caloric restriction, noted Dr. Anand Shah, the endocrinologist consulted on her case. These adaptations typically develop over generations in populations indigenous to extreme environments. Seeing them manifest in weeks represents unprecedented physiological plasticity. While the medical team addressed Rebecca's physical conditions, Dr. Eleanor Whitaker maintained constant presence as the sole familiar contact person from Rebecca's pre-incident life. Their reunion in the emergency department had been emotionally complex, Rebecca demonstrating recognition and connection, but through altered behavioral expressions that initially confused her friend and colleague. "She recognized me immediately," Eleanor recounted, but her expression of that recognition wasn't typically human. Instead of verbal greeting or emotional display, she used what I eventually realized was a wolf analog of familiar recognition: subtle relaxation of facial musculature, momentary synchronization of breathing, and a specific pattern of maintained eye contact followed by environmental scanning that wolves use to establish mutual security assessment with pack members. This behavioral adaptation extended to communication patterns. Though Rebecca could speak and comprehend language perfectly, her sentence structure had altered to reflect immediate survival priorities rather than social connection. Observations about environmental conditions and resource availability, typically preceding personal content or emotional expression. "The window is positioned for escape," she noted upon first examining her hospital room. "Food storage is inadequate for extended holding. Water source is reliable but exposed to multiple access points." Dr. Leslie Hammond, the neuropsychologist assigned to Rebecca's case, recognized these communication patterns as adaptive rather than pathological. "She wasn't experiencing cognitive impairment," Hammond clarified. "Rather, she had optimized her attention and communication patterns for survival in circumstances where environmental assessment took priority over social dynamics. The adaptation was functional rather than damaged, a sophisticated reallocation of cognitive resources." Thomas Blackfeather, who had accompanied Rebecca from the rescue site to the medical center, proved unexpectedly valuable during these early integration challenges. His understanding of both wolf behavior and human psychological frameworks allowed him to function as a behavioral interpreter. explaining to medical personnel why certain approach patterns triggered defensive responses while others facilitated cooperation. Ms. Harlow is operating through hybrid processing systems, Thomas explained to the treatment team during their first coordination meeting. She maintains complete human cognitive capability, but has integrated wolf-derived prioritization hierarchies and social assessment patterns. These aren't delusions or identification confusion. They're adaptive overlays that allowed her survival in extraordinary circumstances. This explanation helped frame a treatment approach that acknowledged Rebecca's adaptations as functional rather than pathological, avoiding the psychiatric misdiagnoses that might have resulted from conventional assessment protocols. Rather than attempting to immediately normalize her behavioral patterns, the team established what they termed transition protocols that bridged her wilderness adaptations and conventional human interaction requirements. Physical recovery progressed with remarkable speed. The shoulder surgery, delayed by 5 days to allow nutritional stabilization, successfully repaired both the joint damage and surrounding tissue injuries. Rib alignment was achieved through minimally invasive procedures rather than open surgical intervention. Targeted nutritional therapy reversed the most severe physiological deficiencies within 3 weeks. Her baseline fitness level and remarkable physiological adaptability accelerated recovery beyond normal parameters, noted Dr. Shah. What would typically require months of rehabilitation progressed in weeks. Her body seemed to incorporate healing and adaptation with unusual efficiency. The greatest challenges emerged not in physical recovery, but in psychological reintegration. After 32 days of operating within wolf social structures, where communication occurred through movement, positioning, and direct environmental manipulation rather than symbolic language, Rebecca experienced significant overload when reintroduced to human information density. "Everything is excessive," she explained to Eleanor during her second week of hospitalization. "Humans communicate redundantly across multiple channels simultaneously: facial expression, verbal content, body language, symbolic representation. The information density exceeds functional requirements by orders of magnitude." This observation revealed profound insight into the efficiency of wolf communication systems compared to human social interaction. Where wolves communicated essential information through minimal signals optimized for clarity in survival contexts, human social communication incorporated substantial redundancy, social positioning, and content unrelated to immediate functional needs. Dr. Hammond recognized this perspective as valuable rather than problematic. Her observations about human communication inefficiency weren't symptoms of disorder, but rather insights derived from experiencing an alternative communication system optimized for different priorities. She was effectively conducting comparative communication analysis between species. This analysis extended to environmental and resource management observations. Rebecca consistently noted patterns of waste, redundancy, and inefficiency in hospital operations, from excess food portions to energy usage to staff deployment. Rather than representing criticism, these observations reflected genuine puzzlement at resource management models that contradicted the optimization patterns she had observed in wolf behavior. The wolf pack maintains precise energy balance, she explained to Thomas during one of his regular visits. Movement, territory coverage, hunting effort, all calibrated to maximize gain while minimizing expenditure. Human systems seem intentionally inefficient, as if excess itself represents success rather than system failure. Thomas nodded, recognizing in her observation echoes of his grandfather's teachings about the distinction between indigenous resource management models and Western consumption patterns. "My ancestors understood this balance," he confirmed. "What you're seeing isn't universal human behavior, but rather culturally specific resource relationship patterns." This conversation represented a turning point in Rebecca's reintegration process. Recognition that she wasn't readapting to universal human patterns, but rather to specific cultural frameworks that contained both functional and arbitrary elements. This distinction allowed her to begin consciously selecting which adaptive elements from her wolf experience to maintain and which human patterns to reincorporate. As physical recovery progressed and hospital discharge approached, Rebecca faced increasingly complex reintegration decisions. Her cabin remained habitable, but was located in relative isolation that medical advisors considered potentially problematic for psychological reintegration. Her photography business had been suspended during her absence, with scheduled spring workshops cancelled and client relationships in uncertain status. Most significantly, her relationship with the Granite Ridge Pack remained unresolved, both emotionally and in terms of research continuity. "I need to document what happened," she explained to Eleanor during discharge planning discussions. "Not just the scientific observations about wolf behavior, though those are unprecedented and valuable. The interspecies cooperation aspects have implications for evolutionary psychology, conservation ethics, and perhaps even human origins theory." This clarity of purpose provided the foundation for reintegration planning. With Eleanor's support, Rebecca established a structured research and recovery framework that incorporated both professional requirements and personal healing. Rather than returning immediately to her isolated cabin, she would temporarily reside in a guest apartment on Eleanor's property, providing social support during readaptation while allowing sufficient privacy for processing her experience. Professional reintegration centered around comprehensive documentation of her observations, facilitated by research assistants from Dr. Whitaker's department, who would help transform Rebecca's field notes into formal scientific documentation. This arrangement served both research purposes and psychological transition, the assistants functioning as controlled social exposure that gradually reintroduced Rebecca to human collaboration patterns. The most sensitive aspect of reintegration planning involved media management. News of Rebecca's survival with wolf assistance had inevitably leaked despite Thomas's efforts to control the narrative. Regional media had already published speculative accounts, with national outlets beginning to pursue the story as a human interest phenomenon. Without structured response, the situation threatened to devolve into sensationalism that could potentially endanger both Rebecca's recovery and the Granite Ridge Pack's protection. Thomas Blackfeather provided unexpected assistance with this challenge, leveraging his position with both the Park Service and State Wildlife Division to establish information management protocols. A carefully crafted initial statement acknowledged Rebecca's survival with wolf tolerance, deliberately avoiding terms like assistance or protection that might anthropomorphize wolf behavior to the public, while emphasizing the extraordinary circumstances and non-replicable nature of the interaction. Ms. Harlow's experience represents a unique convergence of factors, including her extensive prior knowledge of this specific wolf pack through her professional wildlife photography work. The statement noted, "Under no circumstances should this extraordinary situation be interpreted as suggesting general wolf behavior patterns toward humans or encourage approach attempts by untrained individuals." This framing served multiple protective purposes, reducing public speculation about friendly wolves, establishing Rebecca's professional credibility rather than casting her as passive beneficiary of animal behavior, and most importantly, avoiding language that might prompt wildlife tourism targeting the Granite Ridge Pack's territory. Beyond these practical arrangements, Rebecca faced profound personal readjustment challenges. Human social patterns that had once been instinctive now required conscious processing. Environmental comforts she had previously taken for granted now seemed simultaneously luxurious and constraining. Most significantly, her sensory processing had been fundamentally altered by weeks of survival-level environmental awareness. Everything is both too much and not enough, she attempted to explain during a session with Dr. Hammond. Human environments overwhelm with sensory density, visual complexity, ambient noise, chemical sense, while simultaneously depriving direct environment connection. It's like wearing both blinders and magnifying glasses simultaneously. This sensory integration challenge required specific therapeutic intervention. Working with occupational therapists specializing in sensory processing adaptation, Rebecca developed transitional strategies for managing environmental overload, controlled exposure scheduling, sensory modulation techniques, and environment modification practices that created manageable sensory landscapes. Throughout this intensive reintegration process, Rebecca maintained connection with Thomas Blackfeather, whose unique position at the intersection of indigenous and scientific knowledge systems provided perspective unavailable from conventional medical or psychological sources. Their conversations increasingly focused on the philosophical implications of her experience rather than just practical readaptation strategies. You've lived the boundary permeability that indigenous knowledge systems have always recognized, Thomas observed during one such discussion. Western thought insists on rigid separation between human and animal consciousness, a framework that both elevates humans above ecological systems and paradoxically reduces human potential by denying our embedded relationship with those systems. Rebecca nodded, finding in his articulation clarity for aspects of her experience she had struggled to express through conventional frameworks. The wolves didn't just tolerate me, she acknowledged. They recognized something in me that conventional biology would consider impossible, potential for genuine participation in their social system despite species difference. That recognition contradicts fundamental assumptions about species isolation. These philosophical explorations provided essential context for Rebecca's evolving understanding of her experience. Rather than perceiving her wolf integration as either miraculous exception or psychological aberration, she began recognizing it as revealing previously unexamined potential for interspecies relationship, potential with profound implications for both conservation practice and human self-understanding. As physical recovery progressed toward completion, Rebecca began making limited public appearances to address the growing media interest in her experience. Rather than avoiding engagement, she strategically presented carefully framed narrative elements that redirected public attention from sensationalism toward conservation implications. My experience doesn't suggest wolves are seeking human companionship, or that anyone should approach them, she emphasized during an interview with National Geographic, her first major media appearance. What it demonstrates is that our understanding of animal cognition and interspecies dynamics remains profoundly limited. The wolves' behavior revealed cognitive flexibility and assessment capabilities that challenge current biological frameworks. This communication approach successfully shifted narrative focus from woman raised by wolves, sensationalism, toward substantive scientific implications. Rebecca's academic background, professional credentials, and measured communication style established her as an authoritative interpreter of her own experience rather than a passive subject of public fascination. 6 weeks after her rescue, Rebecca faced perhaps the most significant reintegration milestone, her first return to field observation of the Granite Ridge Pack. The wolves had relocated to their traditional summer territory approximately 5 miles from their winter range, with denning behaviors confirming the pregnancy observations Rebecca had noted before her departure. The observation expedition, carefully planned with both Dr. Whitaker and Thomas Blackfeather, incorporated strict protocols to prevent disruption of denning activities. Using remote observation blinds and telephoto equipment, Rebecca would document pack behavior patterns from sufficient distance to avoid influencing their natural activities or creating renewed human association. "This isn't about reconnection," Rebecca clarified when the media requested access to this first observation session. "It's about responsible scientific follow-up and establishing appropriate boundaries. My research focus remains wolf behavior in natural contexts, not human wolf interaction potential." This firm boundary setting reflected Rebecca's commitment to prioritizing the wolves' welfare above potential research opportunities or personal emotional needs. Though she experienced profound connection with the pack, particularly Artemis and Adara, she recognized that their optimal development required maintaining natural behavior patterns without human interference. The observation session itself proved both professionally valuable and emotionally complex. From her carefully positioned blind, Rebecca documented clear evidence of successful denning activity, with behavioral patterns suggesting at least 2 females had delivered healthy litters. Artemis remained clearly identifiable as alpha female, with the distinctive social dynamics Rebecca had documented before the storm continuing to characterize pack interactions. Most significantly for Rebecca personally, she observed multiple instances where Artemis demonstrated what ethologists term environmental scanning triangulation, a behavior pattern where wolves check specific locations where pack members should be positioned, essentially conducting roll call through visual confirmation. On 3 distinct occasions, Artemis performed scanning patterns that included checking the observation blind location, despite having no obvious sensory confirmation of Rebecca's presence. "She's checking for me," Rebecca noted in her observation log, careful to distinguish objective behavior documentation from interpretation. "The scan pattern incorporates my former position in their movement formation, despite extended absence and significant location change." This observation, while maintained within proper scientific documentation protocols, carried profound emotional significance. Without anthropomorphizing wolf cognition or claiming impossible cross-species emotional bonds, the behavior nevertheless suggested some level of continued recognition of Rebecca's former presence within pack dynamics. A recognition that transcended immediate sensory confirmation. As Rebecca packed her equipment at the observation session's conclusion, the moment of truth she had simultaneously anticipated and dreaded finally arrived. Artemis appeared briefly on a ridgeline approximately 200 yards from the blind position, directly visible but beyond practical contact range. The alpha female maintained position for approximately 30 seconds, clearly visible against the skyline, before turning and disappearing back toward the denning area. Rebecca documented this appearance with scientific precision, recording exact timing, positioning, and observable behavior patterns. Her field notes contain no emotional interpretation or anthropomorphic attribution, but the private journal entry she wrote that evening revealed the personal significance beyond scientific documentation. Today, Artemis acknowledged our shared experience while simultaneously confirming its conclusion. Her appearance established visual recognition without inviting renewed interaction, precisely the appropriate boundary for both our species' requirements. She continues leading her pack according to their needs. I continue human reintegration. According to mine, the boundary between our worlds remains permeable in awareness but appropriately respected in practice. This moment of mutual recognition across reinstated species boundaries marked Rebecca's transition from survival-level wolf integration to a new phase characterized by transformed awareness within human context. The experience that had begun in catastrophic circumstance and evolved through unprecedented interspecies cooperation had now completed its direct interaction component, though its implications would continue unfolding through both scientific documentation and personal transformation as Rebecca returned to the research center with her observation data. She carried both scientific documentation and personally transformative experience, dual knowledge paths that would eventually converge into pioneering conservation methodology that bridged indigenous understanding, scientific rigor, and direct, immersive awareness of wildlife consciousness. 4 seasons had completed their cycle since Rebecca Harlow's extraordinary survival with the Granite Ridge wolf pack. Spring had returned to the Teton wilderness, bringing renewed life to the landscapes that had nearly claimed hers. On a clear April morning, Rebecca stood on the observation platform she had designed in collaboration with Grand Teton National Park's Conservation Division, a structure that balanced research needs with minimal environmental impact, located near but not intruding upon traditional wolf movement corridors. The physical evidence of her ordeal had largely faded. The shoulder that had required 2 surgeries now showed nearly complete range of motion, with only occasional weather-related discomfort. Her weight and muscle mass had fully recovered, supported by a carefully designed nutrition and exercise regimen. To casual observers, Rebecca Harlow appeared simply as she had before, a dedicated wildlife photographer and researcher pursuing her professional passion. But fundamental transformations remained, visible not in physical markers, but in perception, patterns, relationship frameworks, and life orientation that had been permanently altered by her wolf integration experience. These changes had evolved from initial reintegration challenges into what Rebecca now recognized as enhanced capabilities, not deficits requiring correction, but expanded awareness frameworks offering unique perspective. What happened next defied this careful separation protocol. After completing standard territory marking behaviors, Artemis diverted from the group's movement pattern, approaching to within approximately 100 yards of the observation platform. There she paused, directly oriented toward Rebecca's position, and maintained extended eye contact that wolves typically avoid, except in specific social communication contexts. Rebecca remained motionless, her camera documenting the unexpected behavior while her mind processed its potential significance. The interaction lasted approximately 20 seconds before Artemis rejoined her pack members and continued their territorial movement pattern. The entire sequence might have appeared coincidental to observers lacking Rebecca's specialized knowledge, but she recognized it with absolute certainty as intentional acknowledgement. Artemis communicating recognition across the species boundary they now maintained for mutual benefit. She remembers, Rebecca noted in her observation log, carefully, distinguishing behavioral documentation from interpretation while still recording the apparent significance. 4 years later, she maintains some recognition framework that includes me as a specific individual rather than generic human presence. The acknowledgement behavior mirrors distance separation communication I observed within pack dynamics during my integration period. This observation carried profound implications for understanding of wolf cognitive capabilities, suggestion of individual recognition, persistence, spanning years, and transcending species boundaries. Such capabilities exceeded conventional scientific understanding of canid cognition, supporting the expanded models of animal consciousness that Rebecca's Research Institute had been developing through its integrated methodology. Beyond its scientific significance, the moment held personal meaning that Rebecca allowed herself to acknowledge only in her private journal. Artemis recognized me today across 4 years and the species boundary we now maintain. This wasn't about potential interaction or resource. Sharing, but simply acknowledgement of shared history. Consciousness recognizing consciousness across conventional separation categories. Perhaps the most profound communication is that which respects necessary boundaries while still acknowledging connection across them. This balance between genuine cross-species awareness and appropriate behavioral separation characterized Rebecca's evolved understanding of her extraordinary experience. What had begun as survival necessity had transformed into pioneering conservation methodology that recognized animal populations as legitimate consciousness participants in shared environments, rather than merely resources to be managed or protected. The impact of this approach continued expanding through multiple channels. Graduate students from diverse disciplines, biology, psychology, environmental management, indigenous studies, now conducted research under institute guidance, creating next-generation practitioners who moved naturally between knowledge systems that previous academic frameworks had treated as incompatible. Conservation programs initially developed for wolf-human conflict contexts had been adapted for other species interactions, ranging from coyote urban management to elephant agricultural interface challenges in African contexts. Rebecca's photographic work had evolved beyond traditional wildlife documentation to what critics termed consciousness portraiture. Images that conveyed animal awareness so effectively that viewers reported a fundamentally altered perspective on the species depicted. A traveling exhibition titled Minds Beyond Human had attracted over 2 million visitors across major museums worldwide, with educational programming that challenged conventional human-animal relationship frameworks. Perhaps most significantly, the Wilderness Immersion Therapy program Rebecca had developed in partnership with trauma specialists had demonstrated remarkable effectiveness for specific psychological conditions. Carefully structured exposure to wild environments, modeled on Rebecca's own integrative experience but with appropriate safety modifications, had proven particularly valuable for individuals with severe PTSD, treatment-resistant depression, and certain neurodevelopmental differences. Natural environments provide regulatory frameworks fundamentally different from human social systems, Rebecca explained in the program's clinical documentation. For individuals whose traumatic experiences or neurocognitive structures create challenges within conventional human contexts, wilderness immersion offers alternative regulation patterns that can facilitate healing and adaptation unavailable through traditional therapeutic approaches. The program's success had drawn attention from medical institutions worldwide, with research partnerships established across multiple universities and treatment centers. What had begun as Rebecca's individual survival adaptation had evolved into a systematic methodology for addressing human suffering through reconnection with natural regulatory systems, healing through the same boundary permeability that had saved her life during the catastrophic storm. As Rebecca completed her observation session and prepared to depart the platform, she noticed Thomas Blackfeather approaching along the designated trail. Their collaboration had developed comfortable rhythms over the past several years, with each recognizing the other's need for solitary processing alongside their productive partnership engagement. They emerged with new pups, Rebecca noted as Thomas reached the platform, sharing essential information without unnecessary elaboration, the communication efficiency they both valued. Thomas nodded, scanning the meadow where the wolves had now disappeared back into forest cover. 7 pups total according to the remote monitoring, strong genetic diversity indicators. The territorial expansion northward has stabilized. This exchange, while appearing minimal to outside observers, contained complete shared understanding, developed through years of collaborative work. Both recognized the significance of the pack's continued successful reproduction, territorial stabilization, and genetic health indicators, conservation markers that validated their integrated management approach while respecting the wolves' autonomous development. Artemis acknowledged me, Rebecca added, sharing the behaviorally significant observation with the one colleague who would fully understand its implications without requiring extended explanation. Thomas raised an eyebrow, immediately grasping both the behavioral rarity and potential research significance. Direct orientation response, complete intentional acknowledgement pattern, 20-second sustained eye contact with classical recognition indicators, 4 years later. Thomas nodded, processing this information through both his indigenous knowledge framework and their shared scientific understanding. Confirmation of extended recognition maintenance across both time and context boundaries supports the cognitive models we've been developing and contradicts conventional understanding of recognition limitations, Rebecca added. This isn't just extended memory, it's categorization persistence across completely altered relationship contexts. Their shared analysis, moving naturally between scientific terminology and direct behavioral understanding, demonstrated the knowledge integration they had developed, neither purely academic nor merely experiential, but a functional synthesis that accessed multiple understanding frameworks simultaneously. As they descended from the observation platform and began the hike back toward the research center, their conversation shifted to upcoming institute projects, grant applications, and the doctoral students arriving next month for the summer research program. The extraordinary had become integrated with the ordinary. Rebecca's unprecedented survival experience transformed into a methodological foundation for ongoing conservation work that continued expanding understanding of human-wildlife relationship potential. That evening, as spring twilight settled over the Teton Range, Rebecca completed her daily journal entry with a reflection that captured her evolved understanding of her experience's significance. What saved my life wasn't merely wolf tolerance of human presence, but momentary permeability in the boundaries we construct between species consciousness. That permeability revealed potential for understanding that transcends both traditional human exceptionalism and romantic anthropomorphism, recognition of legitimate consciousness operating through different structures but sharing fundamental awareness within a common world. This recognition of consciousness beyond human patterns without denying the reality of species difference had become the philosophical foundation for both Rebecca's personal orientation and the Institute's methodological approach. Rather than claiming impossible dissolution of species boundaries or asserting absolute separation, it acknowledged the complex reality of differentiated consciousness operating within shared ecological contexts, from catastrophic storm to wolf, integration to pioneering conservation methodology. Rebecca Harlow's journey had traversed territories both geographic and conceptual. The wolf pack that had once sheltered her body from killing cold had ultimately transformed her understanding of consciousness itself, an understanding now extending outward through research, conservation practice, and direct engagement with those seeking healing through reconnection with natural systems. As darkness settled completely and distant wolf howls echoed across the valley, Rebecca closed her journal and stepped onto the deck of her carefully designed home. The howls carried no specific communication directed toward her. She harbored no romanticized notions about maintained connection with her former wolf companions, but she recognized in their voices the legitimate expression of consciousness, different from yet sharing fundamental awareness with her own. Minds moving through the same world while perceiving it through different perceptual structures. This recognition of legitimate consciousness beyond human patterns represented perhaps the most profound legacy of her extraordinary survival. Beyond dramatic narrative of human endurance, beyond scientific documentation of unprecedented interspecies cooperation, beyond conservation methodology developed from integrated knowledge systems, it offered fundamental reconsideration of humanity's place within, rather than separate from the complex web of awareness that constituted the living world. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.